Well, this is part two of a video I put up last week on biblical interpretation. And I did that because there's been many who have in recent days posted various verses from the Bible and are claiming these verses as personal promises or as prophecies of what's coming. And I'm not here to argue with or challenge any of their things. I'm just here to say before we do that, we need to make certain that what we are calling a promise or a prophecy or is something that we have interpreted correctly, because all of the verses in the Bible are not interpreted the same. Now, they all have the commonality of supporting the same message, because the Bible is ultimately one overarching message, which is the message of redemption. And basically, the Old Testament, if you want to divide this, is like a story. The Old and New Testament, like a story. The Old Testament is the first part of the story, and it reveals the problem. Or if we wanted to use modern day literary techniques or the pattern followed on a television program, it creates the crisis. And then the New Testament brings the solution or reveals the resolution to the crisis. So the overarching message of the entire Bible is redemption. And the Old Testament points to the day that Christ will come. The New Testament points to the fact that he came. Well, if we understand that, then we'll understand that there must be some kind of consistency then in the interpretation process in order for the message to always be consistent with the overall message of the Bible. Now, there's different literary techniques that are interpretive techniques that people use. One that is the one that I tend to rely on, and the one I used to actually teach when I taught the hermeneutics a few years ago, is called the contextual, grammatical, historical method of interpretation. We could just call it the CGH, the contextual, grammatical, historical interpretation. Contextual means we have to consider things we could call the internal context and the external context. External context is the background. What's going on around the writing of this text? There's probably, or could be something political, could be something economic, uh, could be warfare, could be they were in the middle of some kind of judgment or judgment was coming. And mostly that would be Old Testament. In the New Testament, all of the books of the Bible in some way focus on the ministry of Christ. And so there's the contextual part, the external part is what was going on that motivated the author to write and what influenced the writer when he wrote. For example, when Paul writes one of his letters, say to the Romans, you don't see Paul who's kind of downcast by his circumstances. He's pretty much upbeat. He's really positive, and he just kind of lays it out there. This is the way redemption works, or this is really Romans is Paul's gospel. Is his presentation of redemption or the redemptive narrative. So you see one style of Paul in Romans, you see a different style of Paul in Second Timothy. In Second Timothy, you see a man who contextually is in prison awaiting execution. And so you see a man who's a little more downcast in the way he writes and his style, a little more disappointed. Well, if you know that, then it will help you when you're interpreting the book of Second Timothy. Hebrews is another one. Hebrews is one of the only book that was allowed into the Scripture without a known author. And they did it because of the message. The message was such a clear explanation of the gospel from a Jewish perspective. It served as a bridge. It's almost like a commentary, a Christian commentary on the Old Testament. And so what you will interpret hopefully, when you interpret Hebrews, what you'll keep in mind is there was a huge contextual issue here. And the issue was this: the readers, the original audience, which we assume was probably Roman, were people who were beginning to experience persecution and were deserting the faith and going back into Judaism or going back into whatever they were before. And so the writer of Hebrews is writing to remind them there's nothing you can go back to because you can't. In fact, he makes a statement. He says, once you've been enlightened, you can't be enlightened again. And of course, people have run with that and say, oh, well, that means once you can be saved, then you're lost, but then you can't get saved again. And that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is once you've seen Christ, once you've seen salvation that he makes available, once you see God's plan of redemption, you can't go back to a previous state of understanding where you didn't see it because you've seen it. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I used to like to show the picture of the woman. In fact, it's a picture that shows two women. If you can see how their different features show up in the picture, but when you see the picture, usually people see one or the other. They see the old woman and they see a profile of her face, or they see the young woman and they kind of see her face, her profile from the back. So when I used to show this to my students, I say, now which do you see, the old lady or the young lady? And they, about half and half. And then I would say, okay, who sees both? And maybe one or two would say they did. I think they were probably just trying to get a laugh. And then I would show them. I would point it out. And I would say, okay, here's the feature to look for here. Here's the feature over there. Here's the old woman. There's the young woman. Now, anytime in the future they see that picture, they will always see two women. And they'll always see two women because it's been pointed out, and they've had some type of a increase in awareness, some type of increase in understanding. They can never go back to the state they were before and say, I only see the one. And so that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to do, is encourage the readers to remain faithful to the gospel, faithful to Christ. So when you are interpreting Hebrews, keep that little point in mind. The whole purpose of Hebrews is to encourage faithfulness, to encourage endurance in the faith. And if you use the contextual, grammatical, historical method, or the CGH method, you're going to consider, okay, what's going on externally. Just about always there's something spiritual going on. So you can pretty much count on that. If it's in the Old Testament, usually the big spiritual issue is going to be idolatry. Um, God often allowed other things to kind of go for a while, and he didn't, even though they were sinful, he didn't intervene in a significant way to stop it. But when the people of Israel went into idolatry, his response was usually swift and severe because that was the big one. So therefore, a lot of the books you read in the Old Testament are going to focus on that spiritual, their devotion to God, or what we could call covenant faithfulness. And if that was waning, then you're probably going to see a prophetic voice that is negative, and you would also see some type of corrective measure. Now, you don't see that so much in the New Testament because it focuses on Jesus and the fact that when he died on the cross, he died to take the penalty of sin on himself. And again, that's where Romans really comes in a powerful way because Paul explains it from beginning to end. And we're actually going to do a little video study on Romans later. But for today, keep in mind what the CGH stands for: context, external context, what's going on around the writing of the text. Internal context is what's going on within the text itself around the verse or passage you're trying to interpret. whatever you interpret that verse to mean, it needs to fit with the overall meaning of the chapter, or at least the section where that verse is found. It should not contradict. And whatever you decide the chapter means, it should be consistent with the overall message of the book. And whatever your interpretation of the book is, it needs to be consistent with the overall message of the Bible. And what happens if we're not careful is we'll practice some interpretive, I call them shortcuts, but they usually turn out to be mistakes. And we'll talk about these more so later in a later video. But for now, uh, keep the internal context. Don't just isolate a verse. The only book of the Bible you can isolate a verse on and get the meaning pretty well right is Proverbs. Everything else, you will usually have to cover 3, 4 more verses, just depending on the writing. Uh, if you're in the Gospel of John, you may have to do a whole chapter just because of the way John wrote. And you need to do that though. Don't just jump in there, pull a verse out, read it, and say. And what that means to me is this. And I used to drive the teenagers crazy with this when I would say, I know what happens when you're in youth group after you've sang that 10th verse of Kumbaya, and the youth pastor sets his guitar down and reads a verse. The first question out of his mouth is, what does that mean to you? And the correct answer is, who cares? Because who cares what I think it means to me if I don't first know what it means? And so that's critical. We got to know what it means first before we start making application. So context is important, external and internal. Now I know that sounds like a lot, but as we go through this, and the more you do it, the easier it is. Okay, and you can pretty well, if you get some certain anchors or pegs, historical pegs in place, it's not difficult. All right, so context, grammar. So when you're working with grammar, you're just working with the text itself. Some things you're going to have to keep in mind. Grammatically, what genre of literature am I dealing with? So if you're dealing with historical literature, basically you can just, most of that's going to be a literal interpretation. If you're dealing with poetry, say the Song of Solomon, that's a good one. When you look at the Song of Solomon, you see all types of imagery in there. And, unless you really do the work to interpret what all those images mean, it's going to be real easy to walk away from Song of Solomon scratching your head. And the only verses I ever hear pulled out of the Song of Solomon is the verse that reads, "It's the little foxes that spoil the vines." And that really doesn't have much to do with the Song of Solomon at all. Ecclesiastes is another book that you have to be careful to doing a literal interpretation of Ecclesiastes, because there's parts of it that were not intended to be, well, you could interpret literally but not applied literally, and we can talk about that as well. So for them, you're going to have to use something a little more than a literal approach for poetic literature. Try being literal with the book of Revelation. Once you get past the churches in the first few chapters, and you get over there talking about dragons with toes, extra heads, and all this other kind of stuff, and you're trying to figure all that out, uh, you you got to use some different interpretive techniques. Now, there's three, and we'll talk about these more so later as well. But I just want to throw these out to you right now, real quick. Number one is the literal approach. And as much as we can, we do want to stick with that one. But you can't with 100% of the Bible. Okay? And that doesn't take away from the Bible, because the passages I'm talking about were not intended to be interpreted literally. All right? So, literal. In the middle, you have the one that I'm talking about, the contextual, grammatical, historical, and then you have the allegorical, and we'll talk more about the allegorical later as well. But for today, I just want to cover CGH. So C is the context. What's going on? G is grammatical. What's figures of speech? What's my genre of literature? Are there words in the passage that I need to define first? So that's the literary piece of it. And then lastly, historical. What is the historical interpretation of this passage? And chances are, with over 2,000 years of history, church history anyway, you're not going to come up with some type of interpretation that's never been thought of before and it be right. So we need to have some idea of what do the church fathers or those who've gone before us that we have confidence in say about this passage. And that's why you need to be open to study and to find some that you do have confidence in, some commentaries that you do have confidence in. And there's many of them out there. Most of them you can access online now. So it's not difficult anymore to do this kind of work. So contextual, grammatical, historical. And that's going to be the method we're going to look at in the next few videos. Thank you. Have a good day.